Hey everybody, it's hwsteele. Today is May 25th, 2021, which means this is the fourth weekly video for the month of May. It's also the final weekly video for the month of May, which means that it's Gann week. Now you may have noticed that the last few videos have been kind of Gann-centric in one way or another, and the reason for that is I wanted to do several videos in a row leading up to Gann's birthday here next month, early next month. So this video, obviously it's the last video of the month, so it's definitely going to be Gann-centric, but the next video also will be. And then after that, it will go back to the normal structure where I do one Gann-centric video a month at the end of the month. So anyway, with all that said, let's go ahead and get to Tunnel Through the Air. So let me ask you a question. Do you enjoy reading Tunnel Through the Air? Now, I'm not talking about studying it. I'm talking about just pulling the book up and reading it. Because honestly, I don't. And I don't really know too many people who do just enjoy pulling the book Tunnel Through the Air up and going, you know what? I feel like reading a little bit. I'm just going to read Tunnel Through the Air because it's such an easy, fun, exciting, interesting read. Because the reality is, I don't think that it is. And one of the worst parts of the book, on the surface level anyway, is the poetry that's all over this book, especially the first half of the book or so. There's a lot of poetry going back and forth between Marie and Robert especially, but other characters in the story also throw some poetry around. And that's unfortunate because the poetry that they choose to use is kind of dry. Well, the whole book is kind of dry. It's not exactly, like I just said, it's not a fun read. But that kind of keeps it in the classic realm of how Gann wrote his stuff, because not much of anything that Gann has written is actually fun to read. It's not necessarily very well written. And page 30 is no different. We got a lot of poetry on page 30, which is kind of unfortunate. So I thought about actually sitting here and reading it to you, but I don't want to do that. So I'm not going to. If you really want to read what's on this page, and I do recommend that you read it, you can go ahead and do it for yourself, because I don't want to torture you with my reading of his poetry choices. But if we look at page 30 here, we're going to find something very interesting about page 30. You see, Gann puts information, hidden information, in his books. At least I believe he does. And some of the information is the actual information. Like, let's say he wanted to code the number 30, for instance. There might be, on page 30, there might be 30 sentences, 30 lines on the page, 30 paragraphs in the chapter that page 30 shows up in, some things along that line. And that would be, he's coding that number in there, and he's telling you it's important by reiterating that. In other words, you might not necessarily know that 30 is important, but if you pay close attention and find out, hey, there's 30 lines on this page, and I'm not saying that there are, you can count yourself and see. But if you go, wait a minute, on page 30 there was 30 lines, maybe that's a coincidence. And then maybe you see, oh, there's 30 paragraphs in the chapter that page 30 shows up in. So as the coincidences start stacking up, then you start to think to yourself, well, maybe there's something more to the fact that 30 keeps showing up like this than just accidentally, it just happened to do that. And there are actually a lot of things that show up in this book that are really just Gann reiterating something that you're going to find somewhere else. And typically there's something that's out in the open, and that's how it starts, like page 30, the number 30. And you wouldn't necessarily know that the number 30 is important, but if you started looking into things like the Bible or other ancient texts of that kind, then you're going to find 30 showing up more and more. So you might go, you know, I think 30 is kind of important. So you might not notice it right away, just sitting out here in the open. And after finding things that are coded in this book that point to those numbers over and over and over again, you start to realize, I think there's something important about that number. So if we look at page 30 here, there's one thing that shows up on this page that doesn't show up very much at all on this book or in this book, and that's this separator right here, right? So we don't see that very much in this book. So if I pull up the PDF of Tunnel Through the Air so that I can copy, this is page 30 from the PDF, if I copy the entirety of this page, except for the page number, and then open up the Word document and paste it in there, I find that there are 203 words on this page. Now if I remove the separator line there, it's 202 words that are on this page. So we could start working with 202 in regards to 30, which is probably a good idea. But something sticks out to me. The fact that there's a separator in this page makes it more important to me. Or it seems like it could be more important, right? So I'm going to go on a hunch here, and I'm going to delete the words that were on the second half of the page. So in other words, what I'm looking at are the words that, if we pull this back up, all these words that showed up before this line. So that's all that's left in the Word document, and we see that it's 101 words right here. So the first part's 101 words. If I undo this and delete this, obviously we're going to see that there are 101 words on the bottom part of the page also. Don't want to save that. So what we see here is there are 202 words on this page, and that half of them, exactly half of them, are above this line, and exactly half of them are below this line right here, which seems pretty important to me. Now if I bring up the calculator here and I look at 101, and then I divide that number by 30, we see that 3.3666 shows up. That would be the first thing I would think of. Multiply that by 2 would be what we would get if we divided the 202 by 30. But then I think to myself, you know what? 30 could also represent months, right? It's entirely possible. It's the closest whole number to the number of days in a month. So if I think of it that way and look at 101 and divide it by 12 months in a year, I find that 101 months is 8.41666 and so on years, which should stick out to you if you understand numbers. And what I mean by that, specifically in this instance, is sometimes you get a number, and that number that you get isn't something to work with in itself, in and of itself. It's something that is showing you or hinting at something. And this is an example of that. Instead of trying to work with 8.416, you might think to yourself, oh, that's 84, which, you know, float the decimal, and it is 84. But if we look at this, 416 divided by 8, well, that's 52. So there are 416 weeks, approximately, in 8 years. So what we're getting here is a mathematical little hidden gem there, pointing to 8 years being this number of weeks. Now, if we take the 202 and divide it by 12, we get 16.83, which there are approximately, not approximately, but exactly, 168 hours in 1 week. So do you see how this all kind of worked together here? I mean, you have to think a certain way to get to the point where you could actually pull all this out of the numbers that we find. In other words, we'd have to look at the page and go, you know what, there's something odd about this line right here. And then you'd have to go, well, I'm going to count the number of words, which we did, and found that there are 202 words. And then you'd have to use the number 30 to get you to the point where, well, maybe he's talking about the month. And then you would have to take that, we'll start with the 202, since that's how many words are on the page in total, and divide it by 12, and we get to 16.83. And then you'd have to look at that number and actually realize, well, wait a minute, that's the number of hours. If I float the decimal, that's the number of hours in a week. And then if you take half of the number of 202, or 101, since we have this 202 words evenly divided by 2, half of it's up here and half of it's up here, you take that 101, divide it by 12, you get the 8.416. Now you could float the decimal and get the 84 and go, well, that's important because 84 is important because it's 7 times 12. Or you could do what I showed earlier, which is there are approximately 416 weeks in 8 years. So playing around with the numbers, you can get things like I just showed you right here, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there's something very specific that's trying to be shown you right here, other than that these numbers are important. In other words, this page 30 right here might just be a reiteration of numbers that you find in other places to let you know that yes, these numbers are important, and yes, you are on the right track if you are finding these numbers. So I hope everyone has a wonderful week ahead and a good weekend this weekend. I'll talk to you in next week's video.